Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I'm your host, Corey Nathan. It's an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group, a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on your podcast app, review the show, and of course, join our Patreon. All of this helps so we can continue having great conversations like the one we're having today with Peter Wehner. Pete Wehner is a contributing writer at The Atlantic and a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum. His books include The Death of Politics, How to Heal Our Frayed Republic After Trump, City of Man, Religion and Politics in a New Era, which he co-wrote with Michael J. Gerson, and Wealth and Justice, The Morality of Democratic Capitalism. He was formerly a speechwriter for George W. Bush and a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Pete is a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, and his work also appears in publications including The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, and National Affairs. Pete Wehner, thanks so much for joining us on short notice. It's so good to see you. How you doing?
I'm doing fine. Good to be with you, Corey. It's always a delight to both see you and to chat with you, and there's a lot to chat about.
There certainly is. You know, I was looking and I realized that you haven't been on the program. We might have spoken in between, but you haven't been on the program since before the infamous now June debate. I was curious how you processed starting with that Biden's performance in that debate, everything that happened over the summer leading up to the election. How were you? I was reading your work, obviously, but how were you processing all that?
Yeah, I think I was processing like a lot of the rest of the country was, which is observing it in real time was painful and kind of horrifying. Just on a human level, seeing somebody old and vulnerable like that, and so obviously disoriented, so cognitively impaired, just on a human level, I think we flinch from that, and we feel like that kind of moment, that kind of scene should happen privately with a family, not publicly with tens of millions of Americans watching. So that was one way that I processed and reacted to it. The other was upset at his advisors and his family, quite honestly, for allowing him to be in that situation. I understand the complicated feelings for a family, even for the advisors, but at the end of the day, they have a responsibility to do what's right. And clearly, Biden was not up to being president. They had to have seen these moments, and they were hiding it from the rest of us. So there was a level of deception that was going on that was deeply troubling. I felt immediately and wrote that he had to withdraw. It seems obvious now, but you remember in real time, the Democratic Party rallied around him, and it really took weeks and weeks of cajoling, trying to convince Biden to withdraw because he held all the power. The delegates had already been committed, so he had to release them. So they got where they had to get, but it was at a real cost. They lost a lot of time. And part of the reason Donald Trump is president is because Joe Biden decided to run again when he was clearly not up to doing so.
Yeah, I do think when the final analysis is made, although this is going to be evolving over the next decades, examining this moment in time, I do think that decision really in 2022 or whenever it was to run, that was the first big domino to fall. But a lot of mistakes were made, and I think that diagnosis. But what about other aspects of the campaign once Kamala stepped in, her choice for vice president, some other key moments like Kamala's debate with Trump, the now infamous rally by Trump at Madison. There were so many moments in this campaign that might get kind of lost in the shuffle because already so much has happened since then. But what about that time, the summer, the Kamala Trump debate, and other key moments of the campaign itself?
Yeah, I thought the decision of Walz to be VP was not inspired. I don't think it cost her the election. I don't think it moved the needle because those nominations those decisions almost never do, and certainly didn't in this case. I was inclined to go with Josh Shapiro, which I think in retrospect would have been a better pick. But of course, uh, she could have won. Pennsylvania would have still lost the election. The debate. I mean, she crushed Trump. That was pretty obvious, I would say. I thought she was quite effective. I thought he was not. I thought he was horrible. He was himself. What was interesting to me is that it didn't move the needle hardly at all, which is an indication of a lot of different things, including how deeply entrenched polarization is in this country and partisan identification. So a moment that 30, 40, 50 years ago really could have changed an election in this day and age barely moves the needle. I thought she ran a pretty good campaign, honestly. And I think about it this way, which is, Biden's approval rating was 39, 40, 41%. So for her to win the election, she had to exceed that by about 10 points. And for a vice president to do that on short notice, having gotten the nomination so late in the process, and to exceed the approval rating of the president by that amount, 10 points, is an almost impossible task. So she made up a lot of ground. I mean, she ended up with between 48, 49%, which is pretty good. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't a perfect campaign. I think one of the worst moments was when she was on The View and asked what differences she had with Biden administration. She didn't come up with anything, but she exceeded my expectations. I thought she was a good campaigner, uh, and um, and I thought Donald Trump, the way he closed the election, talking about the penis size of Arnold Palmer and all the other kind of bizarre stuff that he was doing, I thought would hurt him. It clearly didn't, or didn't enough to decide the election. So what do I make of all of that? I make of it that enough Americans, a plurality of Americans, wanted Donald Trump to be president, despite having gone into this with their eyes wide open. I mean, it was not a state secret who he was or what he would do. He was advertising his vengeance, his depravity, his moral depravity, practically every day. We had a whole list of things, legal and otherwise, that showed what kind of man he was, and it just didn't matter. The price of eggs was too high, so they went with somebody with authoritarian tendencies. I think it was a terrible deal, and I think we're going to suffer mightily for it. In fact, we are right now. This is what the American people, enough American people wanted, and I think it's an indictment of them and their moral character and their wisdom and their judgment. In many ways, I'd say, a shameful moment for the country, and it's going to get worse before it gets better.
A lot of the questions that you grapple with in your writing are the same questions I'm asking myself every day. So to your point, the election itself, yeah, I think Kamala ran an effective campaign to the extent that she outperformed the president, the then president, and the administration that she was a major part of by 7 points plus or minus. But at the end of the day, she needed to outperform the Biden by about 10 or 11 points in order to have won. So that means that there were a number of would-be supporters that simply didn't come out for her, that did in 2020. It also meant that there were some voters who, however you want to call it, true swing voters or voters that are just unengaged until they cast the ballot itself, that do ultimately decide, oh, maybe I'll vote for the Democrat this time or the Republican this time, that ultimately, in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan and Arizona and Georgia ultimately voted for the Republican this time around. A lot of folks are saying it's simply about immigration and inflation, this past election. But I wonder at the end of the day, even for those who are relatively less engaged with politics and maybe couldn't cite all of the five freedoms that are articulated in the First Amendment and the specific ways that Donald Trump is a very real threat to those freedoms. I just, even the most surface level understanding of who Donald Trump is. There are very, the Q rating on the grabber by the private parts tape is very high. Not
Yeah.
many people don't know about that. Not many people don't know who Donald Trump is. And at the end of the day, we still chose him. So the questions, sorry, there's a long way around the barn to the questions, is what does that say about who we are as a country? What is it? You and I are Christians. We're brothers in Christ. What does that say about who we are as a church? What does that say about where we are? This moment in time and our place in the world.
Yeah, those are good and deep and profound questions. I mean, what does it say about us as a country? A lot of it isn't good, as I alluded to earlier. I think it shows a degree of indifference to truth, to reality, to moral standards, um, even to the awareness of basic competence. Um, I think there's a kind of fever that's going through the country, and people have bought into a narrative, convinced themselves of a narrative that things have never been worse, things were awful, and that we had to take a wrecking ball to government and to institutions, and just basically burn the place down and then rebuild it. I think that's absurd. I think it's irresponsible as a conservative. It's particularly antithetical to my own view of these kind of mob passions, and the impulse to destroy rather than to build up. I think it's largely, not completely, but largely detached from reality. And inflation was 2.3%. I understand the fact that if you net inflation over several years, it went up about 21, 22%. But that was largely a global phenomenon, not to the US. And the rate of inflation in this country dropped quicker than any other country among the Western democracies. And it was at the lowest among the Western democracies when the election you know, took uh, took place. And so I think this narrative that a lot of people, Trump supporters and you know quasi-Trump supporters or Trump supporters who were not committed MAGA members, had created a narrative of the country, that really wasn't true. I mean, it's life is not uh, um, the land of milk and honey, as they say in the Hebrew scriptures, but it never is. So the fact that they went for Trump and decided that they liked the Trump show, liked what he represented, wanted him to represent the country in a way that the president does and that no other person does, is, I think, um, a real travesty. And think it says something deep about the moral character, the virtues, Republican virtues, as the founders refer to it, about the country. I think it's lacking. Now, a lot of people, they go about their lives, they don't focus on politics much, and we've seen this throughout American history, even as recently as the 1990s with Bill Clinton. And Clinton morally makes, uh, compared to Trump, Bill Clinton is a Boy Scout in many ways in his life. But there was an argument of which I remember these debates quite well, which is, look, Bill Clinton had an affair with an intern. He lied under oath. He should be impeached and removed. And the country said, screw that idea. The country's doing really, really well, which it was by objective measures, and we care more about that than what Bill Clinton is doing with an intern. I'm not thrilled with that analysis, but I get it. But I think it's so much more pronounced now. The country isn't in nearly as good a shape, because of anything Donald Trump has done, and because his moral depravity is borderless. I just don't think it was that hard a decision. And Clinton was not a threat to the constitutional order in a way that I would say Trump is. So yeah, I'd say as a CAT scan on the country, it's the results are really, really troubling. In terms of the church itself, I think you can take that analysis and multiply it by a factor of two or three, because Donald Trump is president because of the white evangelical vote. And they voted for him by, you know, He won about 82%. If you took out the white evangelical vote, Kamala Harris basically was a 60-40 split in her favor. So she would be president without the white evangelicals. And that's the core base of the Republican Party. It's the core base of MAGA. There are a lot of exceptions. There are tens of millions of people who are self-proclaimed evangelicals. Many of them didn't vote for Trump, and many of them who did have hesitations about him. But there are certain core realities that I think we have to accept, and that is that overwhelmingly white evangelicals wanted Trump. And to the response that you often hear, which is a binary choice, Trump versus Clinton in 2016, Trump versus Biden in 2020, 2024, and they're liberals and they're a threat to our moral system in a way that Trump isn't. So we agree with him in policy, even if we're not thrilled with him in terms of his moral character. I just think that argument dissolves when you consider the fact that in 2024 there was a Republican primary, and you had somebody like Nikki Haley, who is as conservative as Donald Trump, who was a very successful and respected governor, who was much more popular than Trump was. And in the head-to-head polls against Biden in the spring of 2024, she did much better against Biden than Trump did. And yet, overwhelmingly, Republicans and Christians went with Trump rather than Nikki Haley. So there it was a binary choice where you didn't have to sacrifice your moral convictions, your principles, the causes that you care about. You could have said Nikki Haley would do all the things that I want, probably do them more effective, a stronger opponent against Biden than Trump, and carries none of his moral baggage. And what happened? She was decimated. And he has touched something deep in the hearts of many, many, many white evangelical Christians. And they not only support him, they love him. They see him and they're vivified. It is as if being part of his movement, the MAGA movement, is life-giving to them. And they see his vengeance and they see his crudity and they see his cruelty and they get excited about it. And they think that's what we want in our leader. And I think all of the efforts that I've heard from Christians to explain that away um, is in the end a rationalization. I don't think that they want to look squarely into the truth and say, this is what the American church, white evangelical church, has become. And these are the values that it holds dear. These are the things that it celebrates. This is the pain that it wants to see inflicted on other people. That is us, again, with the caveat that a lot of us would dissent from that view, but not nearly enough. The moment we're in, look, I think we're moving toward a constitutional crisis. We're basically around 60 days, a little more than 60 days into the Trump second term, and he's doing what I would have imagined he would do. I don't know why anybody would be shocked at what he's doing. And things are going to get worse before they get better. We had a chance to take the exit ramp, and we missed it, and now we're stuck.
Lots of questions. I think the first one I want to focus on is the church aspect of it, and as Christians. So I'm guessing that you've had conversations with a number of folks that you've gone to church with, for a long time, people that you considered extended family. And I know in my case, I speak with people then in all other aspects of their lives as part of their families and what they do in their communities, what they've been doing in the church and in ministry is so, they really do embody the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control, right? And there are some that I'll have that conversation that I know they either filled in their wife's name on the ballot or indeed voted for Trump, but they'll say, I hate it. I hate the position I'm in as a citizen, that I have to vote for somebody that I would never even, I wouldn't hire as my babysitter or my dog sitter, let alone
Right.
president of the United States. But that's the position I'm in. For whatever reasons they arrived at those conclusions, that even though I disagree with that conclusion, I can sort of get my head around it. What I can't get my head around is some of the same folks that exhibit the same qualities in all other aspects of their lives that are avid supporters of Donald
Mm,
Trump. Now, we hear the stats. We hear the 80 to 82% of white
mhm,
evangelicals, right? But if you can, I'd love to see number one, have you had the types of conversations that, say, David Brooks would encourage us to have? How to know a person and asking those questions.
mhm,
Hey, tell me how you arrived at that conclusion. When did you start coming to that conviction that this was
mhm,
somebody that you could really passionately support? Like more,
mhm.
personal connecting stories.
Right.
If you've had those conversations with folks that really are avid supporters of Trump in the church, and what sense can you make of it if you've begun to understand their point of view at all?
Yeah. No, I have had those conversations in person and email exchanges. Uh, a sense of knowing other people and a genuine curiosity, which is to try to explain to me the journey. And you do have to be genuinely curious and ask open-ended questions because if you're having a debate or if you're just marshaling a series of facts and trying to argue somebody out of their position, we know for all sorts of reasons that doesn't work. And it's one of the questions that I get most often, which is how do you explain this? What's happening? I think it's complicated. I think it's ultimately rooted in human psychology rather than faith. I think faith is in a sense of Potemkin village for a lot of people, or a proxy for other things that are happening in their lives, all of our lives. And we make sense of the world in certain ways, and then we sort of backfill. And in the case, I think, for politics and Christians, people have certain presuppositions. They start at a certain point ideologically, partisan, philosophically, and then they come back and they tack Christianity on verses or 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 uh, or other things, related to the Bible, and then they baptize, they sanctify their position by saying, well, this is what the Bible's calling me to do, because that gives them a kind of sturdy ground in which to stand. Um, so what's happening? I'd say in my experience, it's several things. I think let me maybe start at the most fundamental level and then work back from there. I think once people have made their inner peace with Donald Trump and they've decided to support him, there were a whole series of accommodations over the last 8 years that they made. In other words, I think if in fact, I know this for fact because I had some of these conversations. But in 2016, if I had stipulated, look, um, when we get to 2024, say, we will have known the following things about Donald Trump. And I just listed them, whether he's found uh, liable for sexual assault, the stolen documents, the impeachment efforts, his role in storming the Capitol, the lies about the election, all the rest. And I had said, this is who he is. Would you have supported him? The vast majority of people I know, Christians, would have said, first, you're suffering from Trump derangement syndrome, coming up with these hypotheticals that'll never happen. That would be the first move. The second move would have been, but okay, I'll play your game. If that were the case, would I support him? Of course not. I couldn't do that. I actually had a conversation with a couple that I've known for a long, long time, and at that time stipulated if he were found guilty, if he had raped a woman, and they sort of rolled their eyes, and essentially what they said is, yeah, if he were raped a woman, of course I wouldn't support him. So what happened? Well, they made a series of accommodations day after day, week after week, month after month. And every time you make those moral accommodations in politics, like in your own life, you can make other ones. You keep cutting, cutting the corners and doing that more and more. And then this weird shift happened, which is the hesitation that people felt, the idea that this is a bug, not a feature about Trump, began to shift. And all of a sudden, they began to see him, and there was, I think, tremendous amount of animosity and hatred for the left, fear for the left, what they're doing to the country, some of which is warranted, a lot of which is exaggerated, but they bought into that narrative. And then they saw what Trump would do. And the version that I heard early on in the Trump years was, George W. Bush, Mitt Romney, John McCain, they may be better human beings, people of better character, but they're too genteel. Trump will essentially bring a gun to a cultural knife fight, and that's really what's required because this is an existential moment. Think about it in the extreme, like a kind of Bonhoeffer moment. So they began to develop that. So what's going on in their minds? One is that they frame this as an existential moment, and that our country is at stake, our children, all of our values, or most of our values that we treasure and care for, are under assault. And we have to tolerate certain things that in normal circumstances we wouldn't because this is such an extreme situation. So that's kind of move number one. Move number two is to um, mitigate and downplay how bad Trump is, right? So it's a version of, look, he's kind of rough around the edges. He sends out, tweets, things on social media posts that I'm not comfortable with. Um, but to ask a Trump supporter, if you've set aside whatever problems you have with the left, whatever problems you have with Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, and say, let's just talk about him and what he did, and you gave particular practical examples, it's like asking somebody to stare into the sun. They can't do it. It's too painful. So they'll look and then they'll look away in an instant. Um, and this was really psychologically fascinating for me, what is the way in which they created a kind of shield that was impenetrable. So any data that was contrary to what they believed about Trump couldn't get through. It's like shooting BBs against a brick wall. And I've had extensive conversations and email exchanges with people. One person in the talk radio world who I'm friends with, and I decided this is couple of years ago, I guess 20, when was it? Yeah, it was a couple of years ago, 23 maybe, to look into the claims that the election was stolen. And I decided, okay, I'm really going to dive into this with them for two reasons. One was I wanted to try and answer every argument they made, go down every rabbit hole they did to test it and to see. And then the second thing was just psychologically what happened. So I had these email exchanges, and I'm not polemical in them. I'm not trying to be provocative. It's very fact-based. It's you claim this in response, A, B, C, D. That was really the tone of it. I ended up taking that as email exchanges and converting it to a Word document. I think it was about 30 pages,
Oh,
26, 27 pages of which were
wow.
mine. And he didn't have responses to what I said, but it didn't matter because he had an emotional investment, his case maybe a professional investment, and he just couldn't let go. And so any contrary data would have created a kind of cognitive dissonance. It would have gone at a core identity. And anytime any of us feel threatened that our core identity is being challenged or is under attack, we instinctively push back. If somebody were going after the Christian faith for you or for me, our instinct would be this has to be true and I have to defend it. And there's the fear of, well, what happens if it's not true, right? What happens if they actually have the better of the argument? What does that mean for me? My core identity, my belief system. And so there's this sense you may have uh, had these experiences as a Christian on biblical hermeneutics, right? Like this, the Bible has to be inerrant and infallible and without error and without contradiction, because if it were, then I couldn't trust anything. And I've tried to build my life around this book. And so they can't let it go because it's just too important to them. And I think a version of this was going on with with Trump. And as a clinical psychologist that I know said, at one point, a repudiation of Trump would be a repudiation of themselves. And that's just too hard for a lot of people to do. Now, we all struggle with this to varying degrees and in different areas of our lives. So it's not like Trump supporters, MAGA world, is unique in that respect, but it's extremely acute. And because Trump is, I think, such an obvious offense in so many ways, I think for a lot of us, it's like, wow, we're testing this proposition. How far does this go? And the answer is it's bottomless. There's no end to it. So I'm of the view that Trump could do pretty much literally anything, and his supporters, certainly his MAGA supporters, would find a way to defend it and justify it because it'd be too painful for them not to, not to do it.
I've been thinking about a lot about the moment that we are in right now and whether those more contentious conversations are ultimately our way through this morass that we're in as a church, as well as just my neighbors, here in my community and around the country. Um, Very similarly to the way I had, when I first became a Christian, had been thinking about doing evangelism. And I'm way oversimplifying it right now, but I've also been thinking about a fellow named Daryl Davis, who I'm guessing you've heard of. Daryl is a African American musician who's brilliant. He cross genre, country and jazz and blues and rock. And in his travels around this country, he's come across now hundreds of KKK members and has gotten into conversations and ultimately nurtured relationships with them to the extent where dozens, if not hundreds, of these KKK members literally have put down their robes. And in many
Mhm,
cases, actually gave him their robes. And it
mhm.
wasn't through when I first became a Christian, the better part of a decade or so. I was I seriously studied the art of apologetics. Um, that style of having to make a ready defense for the hope that's within you, but with gentleness and respect, and having the right
Right,
answer, that sort of thing. Um, but then there's this whole other style of evangelism, in the case of the church, that I love the way that David French and Curtis Chang and Dr. Russell Moore remind us is that, oftentimes when Jesus was faced with a challenge, his response was often with another question to open up the
right.
person's assumptions, but it was also often like, yeah, yeah, that's a problem. Let's go eat. you know,
Right.
Getting people caught up in the relational side of it. Yeah, let's go
Yeah,
have something to eat, and getting around that table and his first disciple was among his disciples, one was a brother of so and so, another one was a son of so and so, but the two who were vocationally identified,
right.
one was a zealot, I think, and the other one was a tax collector. Talk about Democrats and Republicans. They might as
Right,
well be besties compared to zealots and tax collectors. So I've been thinking more about the relational over the more transactional encounters that we have
right.
as a way forward. But one of the other questions that I really had for you and that you've been exploring in the last 8 to 10 weeks or so since the inauguration is the moment that we're in right now. Your piece that came out yesterday that just really prompted. I just had to reach out to you. It's titled "Trump's Appetite for Revenge is Insatiable." And again, this relates to what we're talking about already. You reminded us that he started his campaign for for this last election by saying, "I am your retribution." So one of my questions is if you can account for us, just so that we're clear-minded about it, what are some of the ways that we've already begun to see this play out?
Yeah, well, yeah, as I said earlier, we're about 60 days into his presidency, and so how's this manifest itself? Um, in lots of ways. I mean, he fired the archivist of the U.S., who wasn't even there at the time, but because he felt like she had rightly and legally reported these stolen documents that he had taken to Mar-a-Lago. He fired two Democrats in the FTC because he didn't like them, even though this is against the Supreme Court precedent. He stripped the security details to General Milley and to Anthony Fauci and to his former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and his former National Security Advisor John Bolton. and another foreign policy advisor, Brian Hook, all of whom served him, all of whom are under threats, and some of them very active threats from foreign countries in an act of reckless pettiness because he was angry at them. He's in the process, his administration of crippling the National Institutes of Health, maybe the greatest research institute in the world, because his people think that they were not properly supportive of Trump. He's suing networks and newspapers. He's targeting law firms, major law firms. He's targeting universities. He's calling for the impeachment of judges. He and people like Elon Musk. I mean, this is all in a matter of several weeks. So this is a person who one of the core qualities of him, personality traits, is vengeance, and he's consumed by it. And there's some things in life in the presidency that I think he doesn't really care about. He's indifferent to, I think, to a lot of public policy matters, so he can shift around here, there, and everywhere. But when it comes to vengeance, the revenge, to destroying the people he perceives as his enemies, he can't be sidelined at all. And now he's president, and he has this extraordinary power of the presidency, including the Department of Justice, but in a lot of other places too, where he can do this. So that's just one aspect of his presidency. My starting point with Donald Trump, and I was saying this in 2016. The term I was using at that time was a disordered personality, but he's a sociopath, narcissistic personality disorder. You don't have to be a psychologist and to have examined him to know. If if you're driving a car and there's oil leak that's pooling underneath the car and smoke coming out of the engine, you don't need to be a mechanic to say I have a problem with my oil, it's leaking oil. And you don't
Right.
have to be a psychologist to be able to say this man is deeply, deeply unwell. And we're moving toward a constitutional crisis with the courts. I mean, they're clearly setting the stage for challenging court orders. They've already done it, and I think that's going to continue. And they may well declare martial law at some point. I'm not predicting it'll happen. I certainly hope that it happens, but it wouldn't surprise me if it happens. This is what Trump 2.0 is going to look like, because in Trump 1.0 there were at least some people within his administration who checked his worst tendencies, and he feels like he's learned since then. Those kind of people, whether you're talking about H.R. McMaster or John Kelly or John Bolton or others. I mean, Mike Esper, even Bill Barr, who was a real acolyte in a lot of ways, but at the end of the day said no. Mike Pence, who said in a courageous act of an otherwise, I would say, troubling vice presidency, but at a real moment of consequence, he stood up and did the right thing. That simply is not going to happen now. And in this case, it's all accelerator, no break. And on top of that, they learned from Trump 1.0. They clearly have a plan that they're executing to try and advance what they want. And I'd say the overlay of all of that is a Supreme Court decision that certainly Trump and MAGA world interprets as saying that presidential official acts, quote unquote, are a president is immune to them, right?
Yeah.
So if you recall the legal discussions that were happening, that as this case of presidential immunity was winding its way up, Trump's lawyer was asked whether if a president deployed SEAL Team 6 to assassinate his political opponents, would he have immunity because of the executive privilege? And the person said yes. If this was an official act, then you could get away with it. And so if that's your mindset, and you've got a person who's power hungry, consumed with vengeance, surrounded with aides who are doing nothing but pushing him to consider that. And then you think that you have this get out of jail free card in terms of a Supreme Court opinion. You've essentially said you have carte blanche. You can do whatever you want, or you will do whatever you want. And so we're left to the whims of Donald Trump. Which side of the bed he wakes up on? Does he decide to go after this judge or this political opponent or violate this law because he wants to? And he may or may not, but we don't have much control over that. That's the gravity of the decision that the American people made, enough of them, when they cast their vote for Donald Trump.
So I do want to tie some of these threads together, um, specifically in terms of some thinkers and leaders that clearly have been on your mind and you've been reading and rereading, citing in your work. But before I do, I just want to really dig down a little bit on, you've mentioned the term constitutional crisis a couple times.
Right.
Now, to me, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, one of those crises would be what the administration went right up to the line, if not crossed over it this last weekend. If a judge hands down an order or the Supreme Court hands down an opinion, and they openly defy the administration openly defies that order, that would be a constitutional crisis. But then my next question is, so what? Not so what, like I don't care, but then I guess the better question, the more articulate question would be, then what? So for example, what mechanisms does the judicial branch have to say, no, 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 you can't do that?
Right.
Like what happens then? So let's dig down a little bit on what specifically would a constitutional crisis look like, in addition to maybe the one, if I'm correct about the illustration I laid out, but also then what?
Yeah, I mean, that is a constitutional crisis, right? Because at the core of our Constitution, our frame of government, is the separation of powers, the checks and balances, right? This was the, the backdrop here is that the founders, their great fear was a demagogue, unchecked power of the president. And Madison, in particular, was the driving force of the Constitution. He had done a huge amount of studying of history, and that was their fear, which is we're going to keep keep the leaders, the power of leaders, in check, and that sometimes creates frustration, right? Unlike a parliamentary system where you can just breeze things through. In this case, with the American form of government, it has always been you need the two branches of government, well, three branches of government, but you the Senate and the House, so you executive, legislative, and judicial, and they have to work that through, and that sometimes can gum up the system, but it also keeps some very bad things from happening. So if the judiciary decides something is unconstitutional, whether it's a Supreme Court or a lower court, I mean, historically, and there's some anomalies like Andrew Jackson, but historically, presidents have said, "Okay, you're the referee. If this is unconstitutional, we're going to have to find another way to do this." We really haven't tested the proposition. What happens if a president says, "Oh, that's a really interesting opinion. I don't agree with it. So take a long walk on a short pier." And so I don't think we really know. I mean, there are smart constitutional people, Jack Goldsmith at Harvard, a lot of others who can speculate about this and who can offer thoughts about it. But it's really uncharted waters. I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but this goes back to World War II and Stalin and the Catholic Church and the condemnation of Stalin by a pope, and the line that Stalin supposedly said is, "Well, how many divisions does the pope have?" Well, in this case, the question would be, how many divisions does Chief Justice John Roberts have? And the answer is not very many. He's got a few law clerks. Now, I don't think law clerks are going to be able to do a lot. If Donald Trump says, "You have law clerks, and I'm Commander in Chief of the United States military," guess who wins?
Oh boy.
So I
Now,
don't,
and now
I
you
don't
got,
know.
sorry, now you got me thinking about the difference between General Mattis versus the head of the Pentagon now. You know,
Right, Pete Hegseth, who is the embodiment of a Trump acolyte, and Trump says jump, and Pete Hegseth, if he's sober, will say, "Well, how high?" So, that's where we are. And, if you replicate this, if you've got in terms of the institutions and the agencies of government. You've got RFK Jr., a vaccine denier, the head of the HHS. We have a pandemic. You have Pan Bondi and Keith Patel at Department of Justice and Kash Patel at Department of Justice and the FBI. You have Pete Hegseth at the Pentagon. You have Tulsi Gabbard as head of intelligence. I mean, these are reckless and irresponsible people in extremely powerful and important agencies. And then you have Elon Musk and Stephen Miller, in the White House doing what they're doing. So, it's a problem.
Yeah. Well, I do want to tie this together and maybe as a way to start to look forward, at least in the near term. Um, and I have noticed that there have been a certain thinkers, certain leaders that have been on your mind that show up in your writing quite a bit. In particular, Alexis de Tocqueville, uh, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Vaclav, is that how you say it? Vaclav Havel,
Yeah.
Jonathan Rauch, if I may.
Right.
They've been on your mind. So how do thinkers and leaders those like them help us understand where we are as well as maybe point a way forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the first thing I should say is a lot of these people I find grounding. So I find myself in these moments, particularly this kind of moment of crisis for the country, to try and stay grounded and to find insight, to find inspiration, to find uh, some measure of hope in others who've gone before us. And these are just people that I've known and read, many cases, throughout my adult life. And people like Solzhenitsyn and Havel, um, I've looked to them, even with certain caveats that I would have, particularly for Solzhenitsyn in some ways. But they were people of enormous courage, insight into human nature, and to me, one of the things that drew me to them and that I think is opposite to this moment is they believed in truth. They believed very, very deeply in the importance of speaking truth, of not living within the lie. Um, Solzhenitsyn said one word of truth will save the entire world. And in his Nobel Prize speech in 1970, Havel in The Power of the Powerless, which is his 1978 essay he wrote, talked about not living within the lie and the importance of truth. So I think that's really important now, particularly as one institution after another seems to be going with bended knee before Trump, silencing themselves, not speaking out, telling things they know not to be true. So I think that's extremely important. They're reminders that the situation that we're facing in this country is not the worst that any country has faced, or even the worst that the United States has faced. So historical perspective can be helpful too. And then there's just piercing insights into human nature, whether it's you know Tocqueville and
Yeah.
talking about what corrupt leaders can do to the democratic citizen in chapter 13 of Democracy in America, or Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag Archipelago, talking about how the line between good and evil goes not between nations and people, but within our own human heart, how we're in a sense divided among ourselves. Havel, striving for love and compassion and understanding, even while facing a tyranny. So these kind of people, I think, have grounding and perspective that I find helpful to look to, and some measure a guide of at least how one should think about how one should conduct themselves in difficult moments.
Yeah. And just to point out a couple other thoughts, in particular from Havel, whose work I'm not as familiar with as Solzhenitsyn and to Tocqueville, but I have to start reading. But a couple of things that your thought was, your commentary started with hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well. According to Havel, it is the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out. Hope properly understood keeps us above water. It urges us to do good works even in hard times. Or, as you said in another place, you were quoting Havel, he said, there is only one thing I will not concede, that it might be meaningless to strive in a good cause. So I guess that's a good place for me to ask you the TP&R question, which you've answered before. I'm going to ask you again, though. The TP&R question is, what do you think each of us can do to be able to share space with, have better conversations with, and perhaps even nurture relationships with people across our differences? So that's people who voted for Trump, support him, or what have you, people with different backgrounds and beliefs than we do, get their news from different sources than we do. How can we do better at talking politics and religion without killing each other? Or is it even possible?
Well, it's certainly possible. It's certainly possible. It happens all the time. It's not easy, and if you feel like the stakes of this moment are particularly high, and you feel particular disappointment toward people that are doing things that you think are hurting the country, hurting causes that you deeply believe in. That's hard. There's no question about that. But to circle back to something else you said earlier, which was, relationally, I think to the degree possible, that's what we have to prioritize, human relationships. Doesn't mean that we don't speak the truth uh, more broadly or even to them. But I do think that there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of knowing other people, investing in their life, getting to know them, and genuine curiosity to understand them. And in the end, I would say is from a Christian perspective, which is where I come from, those human relationships have to be prioritized, and we have to do that. And I think if we prioritize human relationships, the ripple effects for the country more broadly can be healthy. And I think we have to consider playing the long game here.
Yeah, yeah. Do you have any questions for me?
All perfect. Great being with you.
Yeah, it's good to be with you, man, and I can't wait to see you in person. I'll be there in a couple months, like I said. Before we go, how can we follow you? Find more information about your work at the Atlantic and the New York Times and all the great work that you're doing.
Oh, thanks. Just Google my name, The Atlantic, the New York Times, and you'll see it. I do a series of interviews with theologians for the New York Times. I did one recently with Nick Walderstorff, before that, Richard Hayes. I do meditations on faith. I write about politics, write about sports from time to time. And yeah, so I'm relatively easy to find if you Google me.
So, sports, we haven't talked about that. Are you Washington all the time?
What's that?
We haven't talked about sports ever. Are you all Washington all the time?
No, no, I'm not all watching all the time. I'm selective in the teams. I was growing up a huge Cowboy fan. I was born in
Oh,
Dallas, but since then it's really driven by people and teams that I'm drawn to. So I'm a huge Steph Curry fan and Steve Kerr fan. So I'm a Warriors fan. I love the way
okay.
they play basketball. So yeah, it's sports is a big part of my life.
Yeah, we got to get into that maybe next time, or taking a game at some point. But yeah, that's a big part of my life as well. But anyway, this has been a real treat, Pete. It's always good to hang out with you, and I really appreciate again just short notice. So you came through as you always do. I really appreciate it.
Great being with you, Corey. Thanks a lot, and thanks for all you're doing to make this a more decent country.
You bet. And as always, if you dig what we're doing here, remember to follow the show, write the review, and you can watch these conversations on YouTube, support us on Patreon. All that stuff is in the show notes. It really does make a difference. So thank you for all of it. Now, go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week.